Hello my crafty friends, this is Monica from Allsewpetite. In this tutorial I will show you two methods how I like to finish the inner corners using single fold bias binding. So if this is something you would like to learn, then keep on watching. To start, take your bias binding and unfold one edge, just like that. Then you're going to place that edge at the inner side here. So we're going to line up those edges together and then you can just clip them in place. Then depending on the seam allowance that you're going to stitch, you need to measure the same distance. So I am using 5mm seam allowance on this sample. So I'm going to measure 5mm going from that edge here towards the bottom. So I'm just going to take my ruler and measure 5mm and just mark it on top of your binding. If for example your seam allowance is 1 centimeter, then from that corner you would measure 1 centimeter. Now we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to stitch that side. So you're going to start at the top, stitch that side, and then we're going to end at that marking. Once you've got that done, you're going to flip the panel so you can see the end of your stitch and your corner, and you're going to take your scissors and we're going to snip the fabric, just the fabric, so keep your bias binding out of the way, and we're going to snip it from the corner going towards the end of the stitch. Stop about 1 or 2 millimeters before you get to the stitching line. The next step is to take this end here and you're going to bring it towards the bottom. So you can flip your binding up and make a little fold with your fabric. Then bring your binding on top and you're going to line it up along that edge here. Then you're going to take this to the machine and we're going to start here when you end the previous stitch and go all the way to the bottom. You might have to maneuver the fabric just a little bit underneath the machine to stop from making any pleats. Once you've got that stitched, it should look something like this. So just double check if you have no pleats on the back. If you cannot stitch that seam without making any pleat, make sure you snip the fabric even closer to the stitching line. So this way you will be able to lay it flat. Next you're going to flip the fabric so the right sides are facing each other, just like that. Align your bias binding. So align the edges and the seam. And then what I like to do is to draw my stitching line. So you see the angle here where you snip the fabric. This is how you're going to stitch the bias binding now. So you're going to start at the corner, stitch it following that snipped fabric, and then you're going to do the same thing from this corner here. So you might want to find the center point of your bias binding. I just like to fold it over. Bring that folded edge just beyond the stitching line and just press it with my finger to make a crease. So this way I know my center line is here. And from this end, I'm going to stitch going towards that corner here. So you're going to take this to the machine now and we're going to stitch that V shape. Make sure you are very precise here. You're going to take your scissors and we're going to snip the bias binding going towards that corner here. Snip it as close you can get to the stitching line without actually cutting the stitches. Then you're going to open your fabric, press one triangle towards one end, then fold the bias binding in half, covering that raw edge, and the stitching line, and you're going to fold the other triangle in opposite direction, and you're going to fold this side of your bias binding in half as well, covering the raw edge and your stitching line, just like that. Now you can take this to the machine and you're going to stitch one side, pivot here at the corner, and then stitch the other side. So to make sure you have a nice and consistent stitch on the other side, make sure you keep your folded bias binding just beyond the stitching line. So you want to be very consistent with that, so your stitches look nice and neat on both sides. Now I'm going to show you a second method that I'm using whenever I'm sewing bulky seams and I cannot open the fabric and stitch that without making any puckering. You're going to start exactly the same, so open one side of your binding and place it alongside that edge. And again we're going to measure the seam allowance. Stitch that side starting at the top and end at that notch. Next you're going to take your bias binding and we're going to fold it onto itself. We're going to line up that end in line with this edge. So you're going to fold it like this in opposite direction to that edge, but the raw edge has to be aligned. So there is a straight line like this. So you're basically folding bias binding by 45 degrees. And then you're going to fold the bias binding again, just like that, and make a fold so it is aligned with this edge. Here we go. And press that with your fingers, clip that in place. Now you're going to stitch this side, but you're going to start where you previously stopped. So if you flip this little triangle, you see where you stopped your stitches here. You're going to start from that stitch, going towards this end. Take your scissors and we're going to snip the fabric as we did previously from that corner, going towards the stitches. So you're going to snip it again as close as you can to the stitching line without actually cutting the stitches. Next you're going to take your fabric, bring everything right sides together, so flip your bias binding away from the fabric and bring it onto itself, just like that. You're going to line up your bias binding edges and the seam. Now we're going to mark our stitching lines. So because we have so much excess bias binding here, what I like to do is to just draw a line so I have a nice 90 degrees angle here. Then you're going to follow the angle of your fabric. Again, you're going to mark it. And again, I like to just fold my bias binding in half. So I make the crease so I know where's my center. And from that center here, you know exactly where to mark your stitching line going towards that notch here. Take this to the machine and we're going to stitch that V shape. When you have that stitched, you're going to trim the excess, so leave a 5mm seam allowance. Then you're going to cut the bias binding going towards that corner as close as you can get again. And now what I like to do is to open my seams. So I would take this and open the bias binding so it lays nice and flat. When you do this, you will notice that you have a lot of that excess bias binding that goes beyond the stitching line. So you can either trim it off, or you're going to have to fold it to the inside. But this again creates a lot of bulk, so I like to just cut unnecessary excess. So when you have that ready, you're going to fold your bias binding in half again. So bring that folded edge and place it just beyond the stitching line. Do that on one side. Clip it, then line up the corner so it lays nice and flat, and then fold the other side in half as well, and bring that folded edge beyond the stitching line. Take this to the machine, and we're going to stitch both ends about 2 millimeters from the edge. Now you know two of my favorite techniques to make the inner corners. If you want to learn how to make the mitered corners, then check out my next video. See you next time! Stay crafty, friends!